I think also the YWCA's YouTube channel somehow. Parts of the event may be recorded and used by media outlets if they're present. At the end of the program, 7 p.m., our partner members will give announcements. All of the participants are welcome to give announcements in the last half hour of unmoderated discussion between 7 and 7:30. We would also like to recognize we're meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through the generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. And that's partly why we have chosen the theme for this evening's Courageous Conversation. Now it's time to start, and I'm turning it over to Amy.
No, Neil, remember Renee is our guest facilitator this evening. So
oh, you're right.
We will yield the floor to Renee. Renee, take it away.
That's all right. I'm always the person to break the norm. So first of all, I would like to say Bonjour Kinewea. That means hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our courageous conversation around missing and murdered Indigenous women. In 2019, May 5th was denoted as a National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And since then, you probably, and even before then, you probably have seen many hashtags with MMIW, and that is what that means. But there are also other movements and hashtags that you might also see. Some include MMNWG, so Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls, or MMIWG2S, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. So there are several different ones. Another one that I see probably quite a bit, maybe even more than some of the other offshoots, is No More Stolen Sisters. So if you look for any of those or any hashtags with those, you will find quite a bit of information about missing and murdered Indigenous women. We today are going to watch 3 short videos and then have some discussion after each of them. The title of this particular courageous conversation about the how laws and treaties affect this situation will become more apparent as we watch the videos, and hopefully all or most of you were able to watch the video or the recording of the program that Billy Bob's niece, Janelle Lubke, did in November of 2020 to kind of set the foundation for what we'll be talking about today, because she had quite a bit of really good information in her program. And that recording of that program, if you are interested in that, again, we'll put that link in the chat box also, in case you did not get to watch that yet. So we will go ahead and start with the first video, which is called Understanding How the Laws Encourage Violence. Amy, there's no sound.
Everyone knows Disney's Pocahontas, a movie that highlights some amazing portrayals of connections to nature, with a strong female protagonist. While inspiring, this was not the case. Pocahontas, also known as Matoaka, in reality was taken from her tribe and held for ransom as a bartering tool by English colonists at just 16 years old. To protect her tribe, she agreed to marry an Englishman as her last effort to keep the peace. She was then stripped of her culture, forced into Christianity, and murdered not long after bearing a child. This disregard for her life can be traced back to the basic prejudice against Indigenous lives, manifesting as a complete disregard for the value of Indigenous lives that the colonizers brought to this land from the beginning. This happened over 400 years ago, yet even now, Indigenous women and girls are still going missing, and not much is being done to stop it. Over 5,500 Indigenous women and girls are missing and murdered in the United States and Canada every year. And more than 84%, 1.5 million Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetimes, because the laws that were set up to govern them reflected those same inhumane attitudes and values which the tribal governments had to abide by. They achieved this by making the tribes both sovereign, meaning they had their own government, and dependent, which means they were also controlled by federal law. Additionally, the US government created barriers preventing justice for crimes committed on tribal land and to tribal citizens, which were hidden in jurisdictions of local, state, federal, and tribal law. Many of these laws are still in use today and directly relate back to what is happening to these women and girls. First, the Major Crimes Act of 1885 mandated that all violent crimes committed on tribal lands were to be prosecuted by the federal government, which means that the US government doesn't need to prioritize the tribes' needs, and that the tribes cannot make decisions without the US government. Then there was Public Law 280 of 1953, which gave partial or total control to the state over tribes within their boundaries. This was a response to the tribes' pleas, but instead of giving control back to the Indigenous people, they gave the states control over their judicial and criminal system. It's important to remember that up until this point, the Indigenous people didn't have a guaranteed right to vote until the 1970s. They had no say over who was in the government that was controlling them. The third law is the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law states that Native governments cannot prosecute for more than $5,000 in fines and 1 year of jail time a person of their own tribe, even for a violent crime. They can't prosecute a non-Native person at all. They have to hand the case back to the US government. By comparison, the average prison sentence for rape handed down by state or federal courts ranges from 8 to 13 years. This law was eventually combined with a new law called the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010, which included 7 improvements to the Indian Civil Rights Act. These improvements finally gave Indigenous tribes the ability to prosecute criminals, but only of Indigenous descent. These laws still prevented significant consequences for non-Native perpetrators. While these laws allowed prosecution of non-Native suspects, it still had to be done at the state and federal level, and those courts rarely followed through. As a result, these criminals targeted Indigenous women living in these areas because they knew they could get away with their crimes in those jurisdictions. Because of strict laws preventing high-stakes consequences to non-Native persons, non-Native perpetrators target Indigenous women specifically living in these areas. They know they can get away with their crimes in those jurisdictions. In 2018 alone, the Urban Indian Health Institute reported 5,712 missing Indigenous women and girls, with only 116 of them registered in the DOJ database, while the other 5,596 cases were turned into cold cases. The cases that were registered and transferred to state or federal court took years to get any form of justice, with only that 3-year sentence. The same as a petty crime. Everyone deserves the right to safety. The creation of a better, safer environment and livelihood is important. The U.S. needs to start prioritizing the lives of these women. Tribal jurisdictions need full authority and resources in order to protect their people, and the determination of a crime being fully charged and prosecuted should be the same for non-natives on and off of their lands.
Mother's child dances in darkness and sings heathen songs by the light of the moon, and watches the stars and renames the planets and dreams she can reach through the sun. My mother's savage daughter, the one who runs barefoot, cursing sharp stones. I am my mother's savage daughter. I will not cut my hair. I will not lower my voice. We are all brought forth out of darkness into this world through blood and through pain. And deep in our bones, the old songs are ringing. We are our mother's savage daughters, the ones who run there, searching sharp stones. We are our mother's savage daughters, we will not cut our hair, we will not lower our voice.
I have to say, I have watched that short film so many times, and every time at the end, when I hear that song, I get very teary-eyed. That song is very powerful. So in that film, the quote that I think struck me the most is, "The laws that were set up to govern them reflected those same inhumane attitudes and values which the tribal governments then had to abide by." So they talked about the difference between sovereignty, meaning indigenous tribes could create their own laws, have their own government, and then being dependent. And the dependence on the US government really restricted and kind of colored the way that they could actually have any power, and was done that way on purpose so that they would not be giving as much power and authority to the indigenous communities as on the surface it seemed. So in the film, it also talked about several different acts and laws that have taken place or been put in place over time. There are also some that they did not mention in this short film, but I guess one of my questions for all of you is, first of all, were you aware of how restrictive the laws were for Native American communities, and not just in respect with the ones that pertain to this particular topic, but maybe in general? And I would say if anyone has any comment about that, or if you just want to put it in the chat, about what your knowledge was about some of those laws and acts that we have and had in the United States.
I'd like to make a quick comment on that, and that is since whenever I could remember, they say being Indian is hard to live, and this is one of the examples, because this is just one segment of whose laws and what laws are governing my life today, and which jurisdiction and which county. the federal government, or the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. All these laws are out there and they just spin around. Spin and they spin and they spin.
And
It takes a piece of you away.
that's a really good way to say it, Billy Bob, because it feels like you're given something, right? We as in the US government will allow you, the Native nations, to govern yourselves, but then to restrict it. I mean, it feels like it's taken away before it's even given. I was actually hoping I would have two of my Indigenous female friends here also, but they maybe could not make it, or maybe they'll join us later. But does anyone else have any thoughts or comments on the information that was shared in that film?
I actually do. I know I don't look Native. I am part Native. My dad is full-blooded. Through marriage, I was related to Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, who is very well known as being murdered for her baby. I do know Ashton, Hazley Joe's dad, very well. And just recently, we had another situation. I live in Wisconsin now, and I just was voted in on the board of directors for community action and feel very honored to be able to be involved in this. It makes me very emotional as well. My husband's first cousin, Aaron Thompson, just lost his daughter, who was murdered by her foster parents in a foster home on the reservation that I lived on for 15 years, taking care of his grandfather. She was 2 years old, Raven. And I just know that the laws, when it pertains to Native Americans, is nowhere near as strong as it needs to be. You look at crimes that are committed by other races, and the penalties are so much stricter. And there's a lot of Native on Native crime. When it came to Raven, she was murdered by her foster parents who lived on the reservation. When it comes to Savannah, it was a white woman that did this to her. But the penalties that are given to some of these people are nowhere near what they need to be. So I just wanted to add that. I apologize for unmuting myself so soon, but I feel really honored to be here amongst you guys, being able to share what we, my son and myself and my husband, have all been through in the last few years, because it's been very emotional for all of us.
Thank you for sharing that, Diane. It is really hard to share one story, but when you have multiple stories, it becomes even harder still. So thank you for having the courage to share your stories. And you're right. I mean, as they said in the film, even though laws have changed and there were 7 improvements to one of them, they're still not improvements, right? Because increasing it from 1 year to 3 years, and then maximum three penalties. So to have a maximum total of only 9 years, that hardly seems like it's justice for anyone. And so there definitely need to be more changes. And I will just tell everyone that another thing to note is there are about, I believe, 7 states now in the United States that have created a task force around missing and murdered Indigenous women, and Wisconsin is one of those states. Billy Bob's niece is one of the members of that task force, and her research is based on not just murdered and missing Indigenous women, but also like violence committed against intimate partners. And so it is very much relatable. I guess another question that I have is some of the statistics they shared in this. So 572 women and girls missing, only 116 registered in the DOJ database. And then the other 5,596 cases became cold cases. That seems improbable. It seems like, can that possibly be right? But it is. And so it's very disconcerting to think that those numbers exist. Any other thoughts or comments or questions?
I'd like to make a comment.
Renee, this is.
Oh, Steve,
Holland.
I'll let you go first. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I am someone who takes a bit of pride in saying that I keep up on this kind of stuff. To your first question, I was somewhat aware of some of the realities that are focused on there. It is worse than I was aware of, very definitely. And it is also being addressed much more recently than I thought it would have. I thought a bunch of this was probably taken care of in the 60s and 70s rather than just still dealing with this stuff. So thank you for it.
You are welcome. And Sally, I heard you too.
I just wanted clarification about what does it mean when 100 plus are registered with the DOJ? Does that mean that they have now that they specify that a crime has been committed?
Yes. So when a crime is committed, there's a report, and it takes particular steps, I guess I'll say. Many of them, when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women, and also I'll just interject this, that in the state of Wisconsin, a new task force has been created for missing and murdered African-American women too, but that has then gotten to a point where somebody is actually doing something about it, where there's an active investigation. Otherwise, if it doesn't get to that point of being registered with the DOJ, it very quickly becomes a cold case. All right, any other questions, thoughts, comments? All right, if not, we will move on to the next video, which is actually out of Canada. Before we do that, I'll answer Judy's question. I would say, Judy, that it is a lot of law enforcement agencies, because if it doesn't reach the point of being a priority, then it stops. So this particular video is out of Canada. It is called Peace River Rising. And even though it's out of Canada, there is a lot of direct correlation to what we are seeing in the United States as well.
Tanse Jahanache, the Helen Ushe Doste Asche Prophet River First Nations. I'm 28 years old, and over the past 2 decades, I've watched Fort St. John and the Peace River region change dramatically. I watched the areas that we used to explore as kids turning to housing developments to accommodate the new influx of families and workers within the territory. I've watched the places that we used to gather as a family disappear, either disappear because of pipelines or become gated off and inaccessible. I took my grandmother berry picking the other year, and where we went, we were surrounded by pipelines and different developments. And she asked me, are these berries even safe to eat? And I couldn't say yes without feeling like I would be lying to her. That's one of the scary things, is practicing your traditional activities and not knowing whether or not you're harming your family by giving them contaminated food. Through my own experiences and the experiences of the other Indigenous women that I grew up with, I've learned that violence in its many forms accompanies the rapid growth of living in an oil and gas-based region. In 2014, the per capita crime rate of Fort St. John was the highest out of 33 communities in BC, almost 2 times as high than Vancouver. I worked hard at trying to address issues that I see within the territory. And some of those issues are violence against Indigenous women and how that connects to violence against land. At first, they were almost separate. And it's been through like my own reflection and witnessing the things that are happening around me within this community and within this area, and seeing that the two are connected.
I used to be able to go uptown and know a lot of people, and now it's like, you know, it's a lot of strangers, and I've lived in this town my whole life.
I found when I moved down south for a few years, and then I moved back, the ratio of men to women, like I wasn't used to it anymore. And I came back and I was like overwhelmed, or I'd getting anxiety, like going to the grocery store sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, there's so many men everywhere.
I see going, even coming and flying back and forth as much as I do, the amount of people that are flying in to come and work here is crazy. It's astronomical. There's like a bus that sits outside for the flights.
That was one of the frustrating pieces, I think, like living down south, is I meet a lot of men that live like that north and south split, work up here and then live down there. And they always talk bad, like, oh, that place is such a like a hellhole or blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how dare you? You know, you take your livelihood from this area, and then you go back home, and then you talk bad about this place when it's what's giving of itself to you in order for you to maintain your lifestyle. How do you say upriver and downriver? I forget.
Down is Yitse.
Yitse, Yichige.
Yichige. That's river.
Saki. Saki.
Oh, this is Saki Nachite called. Indians call it Saki Nachite. You go everywhere.
About a month ago, I was out at the Peace Point, and on our way back, we came across a pair of shoes and then a sweater, and then this young, tall, Indigenous woman. And she was distressed. You know, she had one of her pant legs rolled up. She wasn't dressed for the weather. She was in a tank top, and it was cold out. And I was so freaked out. And I was like, I can't leave her out here. You know, I was so terrified about something happening to her. It reminded me of my own story, and you know, the last like sexually violent thing that had happened to me. And you know, I was under the influence, and I just know that, you know, there's times where people take advantage of that. And I almost didn't come back from that. By that time, you know, I had already went through a lot of sexually violent encounters. You know, I was like 24 and that was my fourth one. And so, you know, I just was like, I can do this. I can make it through this because this has happened. And I know that I can survive this. You know, I remember going to bed and putting my hands like over my ovaries and things because I was wondering, you know, could I even have children after that? And I could not sleep at night and I couldn't stay sober after that. You know, and I've had a long life struggle with addiction, and once that came, I lost control. And it's really hard to live with stories like that, and especially when you won't give voice to them or you won't tell anybody. And when I seen that lady, I just thought about, you know, the stories that she held that put her in that position, or, you know, the things that could happen to her. And I don't want any of those things to continue to happen in this area or to happen to some of our young girls. You know, I have young cousins that are teenagers and they're going to be women soon. And I have a lot of family within the communities, and, you know, I work with a lot of youth, and I just see them as these amazing young women and girls with all of this potential to be anything. And a part of that fight is just fighting for a world that's them that same way, that they don't have to worry about those things happening to them, because, you know, that's a good chance people don't come back from that. And I'm grateful to be on this side of it, to have reclaimed my voice and my power so that I could do what I can when I can.
What was it like to be down here, you know, doing the prayers and stuff like that, just on the land right beside where sort of all the construction is going on and all the trucks driving by?
I think it was really powerful because, you know, as people drove in and out, we prayed for them. We prayed for the workers as well, and for the people that are sitting in offices, as well as, you know, the water and the land and the animals and the other individuals that have been struggling and suffering from, you know, the impacts of sightseeing what it could be. And it was good to be able to sit in that manner and pray with brothers and sisters. You know, it touched my heart. This place, in which was created for us, gives us little choice but to stand. It is where silence is not favorable, because silence equals erasure, equals invisibility, equals death. My voice, our voice, the people's voice is life.
So yet another very powerful, even though it was short film, that I think provides a lot of comparison to the United States and the missing and murdered Indigenous women situation in the United States. And part of that, she mentioned that violence against Native women is violence against all women, and violence against women is violence against all people. And I think that's a very, very powerful statement. And she brought up the intersectionality of the violence and how its many forms also accompany the rapid growth of areas where oil and gas are a big focus in the region. And so some of that intersectionality, some other things that go along with it are historical trauma, which was talked about in the first film as well, the jurisdiction and sovereignty, and who is the law enforcement agency that, or the governmental agency that has jurisdiction in any location. Tensions and transactions with law enforcement, and several other things, but also the intersectionality of that violence that goes along with things like the earth, how the earth is being, I would say, also violated by the oil and gas companies and companies who are taking the water. And I liked how she kind of tied those two things in. The other quote that I thought was very powerful was the one at the end. This place in which was created for us gives us little choice but to stand. It is where silence is not favorable, because silence equals erasure, equals invisibility, equals death. My voice, our voice, the people's voice is life. This film also demonstrated the huge emotional toll and mental toll that this violence causes, and not just for women, but for all Indigenous people. I'm kind of glad that Sally's here. So if anyone wants to talk specifically about the mental and emotional toll, we have someone here that can potentially guide us with that. But does anyone have any questions or comments about this particular film? I will tell you, for me, it felt like a gut punch, and I felt almost physically ill after watching it.
A quick comment from me, and that was my heart almost stopped when in the film, when she was offering tobacco back to the river, and then she was with all the modern way of healing, this young Native woman took a hold of the old teachings. And if you notice that eagle feather she was handling, but there was also a young eagle feather with the big one, and she was smudging. And because where she's standing, she's up against Goliath. And so for her, there's a real center of the whole universe right around her. And she goes off and practices these smudging ceremonies.
So Billy Bob, can you explain to us the significance of having the young or the small eagle feather with the other eagle feather?
What she's doing is actually, that is the ultimate way of talking to the creator, because she's speaking for all people now, young and old. You don't see that very often nowadays, as when she was handling 2 of the eagle feathers. So it does something to me knowing that somebody that's 20-some years old has automatically, almost like clicking your fingers, went back to the old ways.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also, you kind of tied into something else that I was going to mention is towards the end of the film where they're at the protest or vigil, and she's being interviewed and asked how she felt about being there. And the most important thing she said was, we're here not just for us. We're here for everyone. We're here for the people who are doing this construction. We're here for the animals. We're here for nature. We're here for everyone and everything. And again, to know that that is a traditional way of, it's not just about us, it's about all of us, because anything that impacts me or one person impacts everyone, even though you might not see that connection. So I thought that was very powerful, and I was glad that she actually mentioned that also. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? While you are, oh, all right, Sally.
I was really struck by her use of ritual for healing when she talked about having the fourth violence perpetrated against her by the age of 24. Boy, that just feels like a tremendous load. But her relationship with her grandmother and her, I loved them holding hands. That was so beautiful. And her use of the smudging and the rituals, sometimes that's the only way that you can begin healing, is when you're really, really deep in sorrow, to do some kind of ritual. Christianity uses that a lot, but you know, all cultures have some way of comforting yourself. And she did such a beautiful job of expressing that.
Yeah, I really liked that too, how she was able to use something traditional and something from her own culture in order to really bring about her own healing. And I agree, Sally. I think that's very powerful. And sometimes that is the only way, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to use a ritual to help connect to yourself, help connect to your, whatever it is, ancestry or something else that gives you the ability then to start your own healing. So just some other things, and please, if you have other thoughts, comments, questions, please raise your hand, put it in the chat, or unmute yourself. But some of the other things to think about as we are watching these videos and talking about this topic. I don't know if everyone understands. There will be, in the last video we're going to watch in a little while, there will be some more statistics about who the perpetrators are. And because a lot of times in discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women, they are talking about these incidences on reservations or on tribal lands, but it is not the large percentage of perpetrators are not Indigenous. And violence in Indigenous culture is not traditional. Women are held in a position of high esteem and sacredness, and they're givers of life. They're valued for many, many reasons. And Indigenous women have held positions and do hold positions of power. Our current Secretary of the Department of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is a great example. And women also have traditionally been have held very important roles in peacemaking and peacekeeping. And so with that level of being valued and being considered sacred, that it is not traditional for women, American Indian or Native women, to be violent. So some of what we've talked about also with that intersectionality and everything is so with that we've had throughout, so easy for non-Indigenous people to go onto tribal lands and commit these horrible acts against Indigenous women, and I would even just say children in general, because they know that they don't have to have the fear of consequences that they would have if they committed a crime against a non-Native woman in non-Native lands. So it really sets Indigenous women up for being victims and not having a lot of recourse. So one of the other things she mentioned was how that emotional and mental toll causes a lot of drug abuse and alcoholism, and how she saw that other woman and then felt that other woman's pain because she was just imagining what she had gone through in order to be in that situation. I think that there are probably many of those same kind of situations here in the United States. And I guess a question for all of you is, can you think of other places or places in the United States where there is a potential for this to happen because of the laws and how they work and tribal lands? Yes, Janet.
I would argue that any place that women are perceived as less than men, even traditionally or for some more particular reason, women are always liable to be abused in one way or another. I mean, we could just talk about domestic violence in our society, in any part of our society, among any group of women. And if we really paid attention, we would be equally as appalled as you are, Renee, about what we're seeing here, as we are too. It's there's an attitude of power, entitlement, and the need or the ability to dominate nature. And so when you look at all of the ways with pipelines and every other thing, dams, every other thing in that some people feel that it's okay to have that power, then I would argue that that translates into abuse and rape of women in those same areas.
And that's a great example, Janet, because again, just like she said in the film, it is that those situations where people are coming in and, as I said, violating the land also, and then being able to leave and go home, wherever home is, and to take advantage of the land and the people and the women. So I did not write this down. I wanted to, and I forgot to. There are statistics that show the closer you are to, just say, a pipeline that, and by the way, lots of pipelines go through native lands. But the closer you are to that area where there's the intersection of tribal land and, say, a pipeline, the higher the incidence is of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so just knowing that, you would think that more of an effort would be made in those areas, but some of those states are the states that have created task forces around missing and murdered Indigenous women. And hopefully they're able to do some things to improve the situations in those areas. Anyone else? All right, well, I think we can go ahead and start the third film. It is Native Women's Wilderness, and they use the acronym MMIWG2S, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. I saw Ari, I'm going to say has his hand up because I have a grandson named Ari, but Ari could be someone other than a he. So Ari, you can ask your question or make your comment.
Sure, they, them pronouns, but thank you. I was just going to say that where anyone is, where there are poor communities, the poor are often more vulnerable to especially wealthier people coming in and doing that, and that's sort of behavior. A lot of poor folk don't feel comfortable going to authorities, and have had bad run-ins with authorities in the past, and so that makes them more vulnerable as well.
Thank you, Ari. And that's exactly right. That's another situation that happens as far as reporting goes, because if you already have had a situation where you have reported an act of violence against you and had nothing happen to have any resolution with that, after so many times, or even maybe you haven't yourself had a situation like that, but someone in your family has, and there's been no resolution. It's been ends up being one of those cold cases. There's less likelihood of reporting then. So thank you, Ari. That is exactly right. And that is a big issue about why sometimes cases are not even reported. And in a lot of the other information that I have, it says, when they're talking about the 5,000 plus women and girls who have been, who are missing or murdered, that's an estimate that we don't even know for sure what that actual number is because of lack of reporting. All right, if nobody has any other comments or questions, we'll start this film. This one's very short.
3 out of 4 Native women will be physically assaulted. Advocates believe that crimes against Native women are underreported and underestimated. 88% of the crimes committed against Indigenous women are interracial. 1 in 3 Native American women will be raped in their lifetime. The second leading cause of death for Indigenous girls ages 1 to 4 is murder.
Rarely do we find laws and policies that protect trans community.
Violence accounts for 75% of deaths in Indigenous youth ages 12 to 20.
We pray for and honor these relatives.
Ashlyn Mike from the Diné tribe. She was 9 years old and she was murdered. Carol Swan from the Shuchanga Lakota Oyate, the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. She is my auntie. She was murdered.
Evie Ortegon and her baby boy. She was killed by medical neglect. She's Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho. She is my sister.
Stacy Hill, 17 years old, from the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe Indians located in northern Minnesota. She was murdered.
Fred Martinez, Navajo, 16 years old, transgendered, murdered.
Jancenta Eagle Deer, Brule Lakota, killed in a hit and run in 1975.
In 2019, the Senate officially designated May 5th as National Day of Awareness for MMIW. It honors the birthday of Hannah Harris, a Northern Cheyenne woman who went missing in Montana and was determined to have been raped and murdered.
So like I said, that was a very short video, but I would argue maybe the most powerful of all three because of those statistics. Before we talk about those though, it showed the why the red and the handprint very quickly. So I'll just read to you what it said. In various tribes, red is known to be the only color spirits see. It is hoped that by wearing red, we can call back the missing spirits of our women, two spirits, and children so we can lay them to rest. The red handprint symbolizes the voices who were silenced. So it is a very powerful symbol. I think that red handprint across the face, across the mouth. There's not a lot of guessing what that means. But some of the statistics, again, the very first time I watched this short video, I felt sick to my stomach because of the different statistics that they gave. 3 out of 4 Indigenous women will be physically assaulted. 88% of crimes committed against Native women are interracial. That goes back to what I said about it not being the violence against women not being traditional. 4 out of 5 victims of sexual assault described the perpetrator as white. Goes back to the intersectionality of the location where this is happening and how it's tied into some of the development and like the oil lines. 2 out of 3 two spirits have been sexually assaulted. Two spirits, again, is the name used for transgender Indigenous people. These next two statistics really hit me hard. Second leading cause of death for Indigenous girls ages 1 to 4 is murder. 1 to 4. That's crazy to even spend any time thinking about. 75% of violence accounts for deaths for Indigenous youth ages 12 to 20. That is, again, another, how do you even wrap your head around some of these statistics? 1 of 4 murders is 18 years of age or under, and 1 of 3 Native women will be raped. I don't know. I would like to get some of your thoughts and feelings about some of those statistics and how intense they are. Thank you, Neil, for sharing in the chat about Canopy and the films that are available on Canopy. Those films are generally independent film and things you will not necessarily see on regular TV. Some of them are, but a lot of them are not widely available otherwise.
This one is is part of the Great Courses, and it's a cooperation between Smithsonian and the Great Courses. The person who teaches it is not a Native American, but the goal of the course is to help us see American history through a different lens than the one we're used to, and it was helpful. It particularly to trace the history down through the years, and especially to see more about the laws that Renee was talking about that have made a difference in the relationship between whites and Native Americans. Anyway, we watched it. It's 24 half-hour sessions, and I would highly recommend it.
Thank you, Neil. There are several other resources, and Amy, you could put some of those other ones in the chat. She has put the link to all 3 videos in the chat as well. But there are many other resources. Probably you could have a book that would be filled with resources. I'll talk a little bit more about some different resources in a moment, but first I wanted to make sure that anyone who wanted to share their thoughts or feelings about that last video, or if you have any questions about any of the videos or anything we've been talking about.
I would say that probably people who are not close to the reservations did not know the laws and the rules, but those who are closer to the reservations know the rules, right? They know what the laws are. That is why it's continuing to happen. They know that they cannot be prosecuted, or they're not going to really look into it. So it's more people who are close by realize that. And what is the deterrent, right? What is the deterrent from it? The deterrent, you're looking at 5,000 and some odd that we say, and those are more likely unrepresented numbers, right? Those are not the full numbers, only 112, right, in the past year that we know of. So there is no real deterrent, and laws have been made purposefully for there to be a less than deterrent. You're not going to get me to believe that they're not purposefully made. So I was watching on Courageous Conversations, this young Native American doctor was talking about laws being made and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And one of the reasons that they didn't make any change was because if you go onto Native American land, you can't vote. So that was the reason. But if I go to Illinois, I can't vote in Illinois, right? But I'm still going to be prosecuted. So, but we're going to use that at the Supreme Court level to justify why that's not being done. Those laws are put purposeful. And again, because of historically what we've done here in America, right, with minorities, Native American population, it just continue to perpetuate this.
Yeah, thank you, Lonnie. You're right. And I would agree that the laws were made intentionally to continue. Even some of the more recent acts and laws, even as recent as 2010, really still are developed, created to look pretty on the outside. They come wrapped in a really pretty package with a bow, but they're not. And again, you're right. If you don't live close to tribal lands or a reservation, you might not be aware, but we can all become aware, right? By doing what you've done, doing what Neil and Kay have done, reading, watching more videos, looking for more resources, and becoming more aware of what is going on and really understanding the situation and how it is. So anyone else? Yes, Janet.
I guess I'm wondering what difference it makes if you're close to a reservation or not, or whether you understand the laws and what you can get away with or not. What the bottom line is, these women are being murdered and abused by some men who think it's okay to do it wherever they live. And I think we need more of a look at, I'm not saying all men are rapists or abusers, but there is the attitude among some men that rape and abuse is their right. Why? Why did they think that? And we talked about that a little earlier when we talked about our attitude toward nature and the land, that you can abuse nature and the land. And if natives are seen, and other people, not just natives, as part of that, then it's okay. Is it okay then? Is it your right? And just don't be where you're going to get caught. I mean, the bottom line is, what are those, who are those people, men who like to rape and abuse women and think it's fine to do that? And why, besides being sympathetic to the women, and of course we all are, we should be very angry at those men, and we should have set up a situation where there's a lot more recourse against them.
Well, and you actually brought up a really good point, Janet, also because that I just realized I forgot to mention as I was talking about all the numbers and statistics and whatever, is so it isn't something that just happens on tribal land, right? And why is it still so rampant even outside of tribal lands? And I would argue that's because of racism, right? So just looking at the state of Wisconsin, there are approximately 68,000 Native Americans living in the state of Wisconsin. The majority live in metro areas in the state, and the largest population is in Milwaukee. So of those 68,000, about 7,300 live in the Milwaukee and Milwaukee metro area. Well, there's not tribal land right there. There's not a reservation right there. So then how do we explain that? Again, it can be explained probably because of racism, and then the value or lack of value put on women, perhaps to start with, and Indigenous women specifically. So yeah, thank you for saying that, because that reminded me of those statistics that I forgot to even mention.
So can I
Besides
say
all
this?
this
I want
other
to make
stuff,
sure that my words were not taken out of context. Because one, I just want to make sure that it's never okay, right? So if you took that on my words, I wanted to clarify that. What I was more referring to with my statement is that when we look at, let's just look at the United States, and we talk about discrimination, we talk about racism, and we talk about dealing with Indigenous people, people of color, or whatnot, right? Laws are the things that move people away from doing horrible things. And without laws being in place, we continue to do horrible things. And the laws that are in place are ineffective. They're asinine, really, because you're talking about what, 3 years, but the average is 9 to 13 years. Why is there such a discrepancy there? And what I meant by is people who are closer, they realize that they're not going to be prosecuted. And when people realize that they're not going to be prosecuted, they do stuff. Now, is absolutely wrong. But the fact that we have things set up that people are not going to be prosecuted, that is a huge problem. And that's my point, that when people are closer to these reservations, they know that they're not going to be prosecuted, that there is no ramification from them doing these acts that should never happen, right? So that's where I was coming from, is that people realize that, and it becomes known in those areas that if you go over here, they can't prosecute you. Like I was saying when I was listening to, if you get caught on Native American land, all they could do at one time is drive you to the edge of the reservation and tell you to get out. They couldn't prosecute you on the land, right? That is a broken system. And people who are around that, they are aware of that. And so that is what I was referring to, is that people who are around that realize that they're not going to be prosecuted, so they do it. And not saying that is right, because it absolutely isn't right. There's something wrong with a man who feels like he can do that. But realistically, we look at how people have been treated, minorities in this country since its inception, right? That without laws being in place and prosecution happens for doing these despicable things, that people continue to do them.
Thank you, Lonnie, for clarifying that. Yes,
I had a
Janet.
quick comment there on that. I have to agree a lot with Lonnie and some of his comments. These laws on reservation lands, they were directed, I mean, it's racism. They were directed at the Native people. If you think about it, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created because Indians had a lot of land, and they had a lot of minerals and oils on those lands. And the United States government, even to this day, still says that Indians aren't smart enough to handle their own affairs. And so that's why the Bureau of Indian Affairs is there. All these crazy laws that surround the Native community. I personally have 4 pieces of property within the reservation. One of the properties is a 2-acre section. And do you realize that there is 611 people on that 2-acre parcel of land. Land on reservations were split and split and split and split to the point where it's absolutely worthless. That's a crazy law. The social service laws, they can come right in, even today, take your child away if they deem fit and send them down to Milwaukee or some white community. And you really don't have a lot to say. That's a pretty close overview of how boarding school started. And so the life of a Native woman has been deemed by several courts as absolutely useless, worthless. I'm sure, I don't know of the other minorities within the United States of America, but I'm sure a lot of laws are directed just at them too. When we had the big fight out at the Dakotas a couple, 2-3 years ago, they passed 163 laws within a week. Within a week. And one of them was it was okay to run over an Indian with your automobile. It was legal.
That ties into Stephanie's comment in the chat too about not just laws, but also culture, peer groups, family, corporations, etc. all have to look at their cultures. How do we get a culture of respect for all humans and nature? Without that, I think we're running up against a really difficult situation. All right, Janet, I will give you a few minutes and then I've got a couple more things to talk about before we end the program.
I don't have much more to say, although, and I agree with Stephanie. Laws come out of cultures and cultures come out of values. And why do some people have those, why do they accept those values that say that some people's lives are worthless? And why do not other people accept those values? And I think that's an important distinction. Otherwise, we all women should live in fear. Who would we trust if there weren't some men who had some values that would not allow them to abuse and kill women?
Thank you. All right, so now you're probably wondering, what can I do? Is there anything I can do? Well, you can be an ally to all Native Americans, and especially Native American women. And there is a group who I am representing as the facilitator for this program, that is Allies of Native Nations. We meet the 4th Tuesday of each month at 6 p.m. Currently, we are meeting virtually. If you are interested in joining us, in a moment, I will put my email address in the chat and you can contact me and let me know that you would like to join us. We also sponsor several programs and different things. So last year we had the Indigenous Peoples Day celebration in October. We have had, like I said, Billy Bob's niece as a speaker for one of the DAT's social justice programs. So that's one way you can become an ally, but you can also become an ally just by becoming more aware of the situation and what is going on. As I said earlier, you can write to our legislators and let them know your concern about the situation. And if you go to the Wisconsin Department of Justice Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force website. You can get access to some of the things they're working on, the meeting agendas and minutes from their meetings. So there are some ways right there that you can help. There are also lots and lots of resources. The Allies of Native Nations has a resource guide that you can access on the Diversity Action Team's website. Allies has its own separate page there. And we have created a resource guide that covers lots of things. It was originally intended for educators, but does include other information, just general information. And then May 5th in Madison, it is Red Dress Wrap the Capitol Red Day. That is 12 to 2 at the Capitol Square. So if you're available on May 5th, which again is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Awareness Day, you can attend that event at the Capitol. Again, there are so many ways that you can learn more, and thank you to everybody who shared the book titles in the chat. And then Steve, I saw, or no, who did? Somebody shared in the chat another link besides the one that Amy was sharing. Oh, no, David Salmon was sharing from my list of resources too, but David shared another one. So again, I would say you can, and yes, there is a Facebook event for the Red Dress event in Madison on May 5th. There is. There are many things you can do to learn more and to be engaged and be involved. And as I said, if anyone has any questions about any of the Allies things or even more about this topic, I will put my email address in the chat, and please feel free to reach out to me. At this time, I'm going to hand it back to Amy and Neil.
Thank you, Renee. Job well done. We really appreciate all of the hard work that you put into this presentation. And it was a pleasure to share the platform with you. So thank you again for putting this together. I just have a couple announcements. The YWCA Rock County this Thursday is going to be hosting a lunch and learn. I am so excited to sit down and have a conversation. I'm trying to do two things at once with Tia Murray. She is the founder and CEO of Harambe Village Doulas, and our discussion this Thursday will be dismantling racial health disparities in maternal and child health. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to sit down with her and to talk about that topic. I will put this in the chat in just a minute. Also received an email from Jean Carfora. She wanted me to give an update on the DAT May event. So I'm going to read this. It says our next program will be May 19th, 6 to 7:30 via Zoom on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Rock County. We'll be bringing in guest speakers from Rock County, and they include Josh Smith, Tasha Bell, and Dr. Atira Coleman. For all of you that came to our Stand Against Racism event in Janesville, Dr. Atira Coleman was our keynote speaker. She did a fantastic job. We're also going to hear from Sally McCoy and the Poor People's Campaign and Stephanie Gates from the Janesville School District stakeholders. This will give us an opportunity to know what's going on within the county and what can be done individually and by other school districts concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion. Neil or Julie, are there any other program partner announcements before we do our resolution check-ins?
That's right. The other thing I should say for Diversity Action Team is that we're having our annual meeting on the 9th, which is what day of the week? It's on Monday, 2 weeks from today. So if anybody is interested in that, I will put my email in the chat and you can be in touch with me and we'll get you the information.
All right, so just a quick announcement that we will kick off the parking lot. Neil's going to open us up in about 4 minutes. And the first thing that we'll begin with in the parking lot, and then we'll yield the floor to continue the conversation, is Reverend Ari, I believe is still with us. So when we open the parking lot, he will be giving an announcement about the Poor People's Campaign. So that'll happen right at 7. But right now, we have concluded our partner announcements. Many of you who attended our December Courageous Conversation knows that it was about New Year's resolutions. And we did a bit of a spin on that. So it was your resolutions that was centered on racial and social justice. So if there is anyone in the meeting who has done some great work, you've come across a tool that was very helpful to you or a resource, this is your moment to unmute and to share your progress update of how you've been keeping that resolution with the group.
Did a lot of good. You go, Neil.
Well, you're the one who spoke first. Go ahead.
No, I'm always waiting for you to kick it off.
I have to confess to doing my part by listening to that class from Canopy. But that was not what I resolved to do. What I resolved to do was to have face-to-face conversations with people. And so next month, ask me again.
Will do. Janet, go right ahead.
Oh, heck, I should have kept my mouth shut. I am trying really hard to be aware when I see minority people that their lives are not as easy as mine. No matter what difficulties I have, their lives are not as easy as mine. And it's easy. It works for me because I have 3 grandchildren that are minorities. And I'm paying more attention to their lives outside of their home and trying to translate in my head what that means to them and how they feel about it. And of course, talking to them about it too. So that's mine.
Thank you, Janet. So we have less than a minute left before we open the parking lot and hear about the Poor People's Campaign. Last call for anyone who would like to share out on how their resolution is going.
Okay, I'll throw something out there. To keep the door open for Native issues, over the weekend, went to Chicago to part of this museum to be part of a celebration of me. It was like the goofiest thing you ever heard of. I got a call 4 weeks ago that there's a giant Billy Bob hanging in a museum down by Chicago. And then the museum called and asked if we could bring the drum and dedicate this section of the museum. So basically, I was honoring myself. Sounds kind of goofy, doesn't it? But the real thing is when I called back home up on the reservation Sunday night, and we were talking about it, I remembered the day coming from the reservation that there wasn't any life left in me. You know, and I just want other natives, especially native children, to know that there are possibilities out there. You too could be hanging in a museum someday. Of all people, me, Billy Bob.
What a great example, Billy Bob.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that was my example.
Okay, and I just want to remind people, because there's all this good stuff in the chat, that the way you save the chat is to go to the very bottom and there's 3 dots. If you click on the 3 dots, it says save chat, and you click on save chat and it's saved. And it's probably going to be under Zoom something. So you just have to search for where it is in your computer, but it's saved.
Thank you, Neil, for that reminder. I am going to end the recording, and Neil, if you could open up the parking lot, and then Reverend Ari, the floor is yours.